Let us take a moment to cast our minds, those peculiar pink puddings sloshing around in our skulls, back to a time that is both curiously remote and unnervingly familiar. The 4th century BCE, the sun-drenched Mediterranean world, in full philosophical bloom. Athens, battered by wars and wranglings, still lurches about as the center of intellectual ferment. Plato is putting the finishing touches on his celestial forms. Aristotle is gleefully pinning butterflies of knowledge to the corkboard of logic and categorization. And Socrates, already shuffled off this mortal coil, looms large as the gadfly who asked too many questions and drank hemlock as a consequence. It is, you might say, a golden age of thought. But make no mistake, it is emphatically not a golden age for everyone. This is a world where freedom and intellect are the toys of men. Free-born men, preferably rich and Athenian. Women, by and large, are expected to remain indoors, obedient and ornamental, occupied with weaving, childbirth, and keeping their opinions thoroughly unexpressed. The idea of a woman standing in the agora, sparring with philosophers, espousing radical views on virtue and society, it would have been about as likely as a goat conducting a symphony. And yet, there she was, Hipparchia of Maroneia. Her name alone seems to shimmer with contradiction. A woman of letters in a world where women weren't supposed to read. A philosopher among men who considered reason their exclusive domain. A self-declared cynic in a society that prized order, beauty, and the carefully curated illusion of virtue. Born into wealth in the northern Greek city of Maroneia, now a rather less glamorous patch of Thrace, Hipparchia was raised among silk cushions, fragrant oils, and all the trappings of cultivated prosperity. Her family was, by all accounts, well off and relatively progressive, at least by the standards of the time. She was educated, which is already remarkable, and what's more, she seems to have used that education not to refine her needlepoint or pen delicate odes to Apollo, but to immerse herself in philosophy. That, dear listeners, was not merely unusual, it was borderline incendiary. We can imagine, perhaps, a younger Hipparchia, sharp-eyed, unsatisfied, asking questions that made dinner parties awkward. She may have read Plato and found him too distant, too ethereal. She may have encountered the teachings of Aristotle and found them clever but dry. And then, she discovered the Cynics. Now, if you'll indulge a quick aside, it is worth clarifying what cynicism meant in ancient Greece. The term has since withered into a sort of weary pessimism, the intellectual equivalent of a world-weary sigh. But the original Cynics were anything but apathetic. They were wild-eyed idealists with the souls of rebels, calling for a radical return to nature, a stripping away of artifice, convention, hypocrisy. They believed that to live well was to live simply, virtuously, and in complete freedom from society's illusions. Their most famous mascot was Diogenes of Cynic, a man who scandalized polite society by living in a barrel, barking at passers-by, and performing, well, let's call them bodily functions, in full view of the public, to remind people of their own absurd pretensions. But it was Crates of Thebes, Diogenes' gentler spiritual heir, who caught Hipparchia's attention. Crates had also abandoned wealth and privilege to embrace the life of a philosophical mendicant. He was regarded as a sort of holy fool, a man of immense insight, wrapped in a blanket of absurdity. He gave away his fortune, lived in cheerful poverty, and wandered the streets spouting wisdom like an unwashed oracle. Where others saw a lunatic, Hipparchia saw a sage. More than that, she saw a soulmate. It's difficult to convey just how seismic her decision was. This was no teenage infatuation. Hipparchia wasn't merely in love with a man, she was in love with an idea, with a way of being. When she declared her intention to marry Crates, her family were aghast. They attempted to distract her with more conventional suitors, with pearls and politics and promises of comfort, but she stood firm. She said with unflinching resolve that if she were not allowed to marry Crates, she would take her own life. Now this is not romantic bluster, it's philosophical clarity. In a society where a woman's fate was yoked entirely to the marital yoke, she was essentially saying, "If I cannot choose the terms of my life, I will choose its end." She was not pleading for her heart, she was asserting her autonomy. Crates, for his part, tried to dissuade her. He knew the cost of cynicism, the way it scraped away every veneer of comfort. He even performed an act of almost theatrical humility, standing naked before her and saying, "Here is your husband, and these are his possessions." Not a chest of gold, not a villa in the countryside, just a cloak, a staff, and a head full of dangerous ideas. She married him anyway, and in doing so, Hipparchia achieved something few philosophers ever manage. She transformed her life into a living argument. She abandoned her wealth, took up the threadbare cloak of the Cynics, and began walking the streets of Athens, not behind her husband, not in his shadow, but beside him, as his equal. She debated in public. She refuted pompous scholars. She faced mockery not with timidity, but with devastating wit. When a man tried to shame her for appearing in public with Crates, she replied, "I, who do not consider wrongdoing to be shameful, should not be ashamed of following the teachings of Crates." She made philosophy not merely a discipline of the mind, but a performance, a provocation, a rebellion. And unlike her male peers, she did so with no institutional backing, no safety net, and the added burden of a society outraged by her very presence. In truth, we have only fragments of her life, passing mentions, scattered anecdotes, the odd barb of dialogue. Her works, if she wrote any, are lost. But perhaps that's fitting. Hipparchia was not a philosopher of scrolls and symposiums. She was a philosopher of action, of embodiment, of contradiction embraced, and conventions defied. In a world built to keep women silent and invisible, she chose, quite magnificently, to be loud and seen. It is a delicious irony, is it not, that the Cynics, those professed enemies of status, wealth, and recognition, ended up being some of the most talked about figures of their age. Like punk rockers of the ancient world, they eschewed the finery of polite society, yet couldn't help but become celebrities in their own ragged right. And among this curious gang of philosophic dropouts, one figure shimmered with exceptional audacity: Hipparchia. Now firmly installed, if that's not too grand a word for a life lived largely outdoors, beside Crates, Hipparchia embraced the Cynic lifestyle with what can only be described as gleeful defiance. Gone were the gowns, the maids, the intricacies of social performance. In their place, a coarse wool cloak, a shoulder bag, and the radiant glow of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to question. And my, how she questioned. Athens, for all its philosophical prestige, was still a society stuffed to its marble cornices with rigid expectations, especially when it came to women. The Athenian woman was meant to be invisible in public, inaudible in debate, and above all, inconsequential in intellectual life. But Hipparchia, glorious, subversive Hipparchia, did not merely ignore these rules. She trampled them. She debated openly in the agora. She took part in public discourse alongside the men, those self-important sages puffing about with their syllogisms and semantics. She was not a curiosity, not a novelty act, not a tame mascot for feminist progress avant la lettre. She was a thinker, one who could match and often outmatch the established scholars of her day. One famous encounter captures this beautifully. The philosopher Theodorus, known for his sharp tongue and rather dim view of women, once attempted to embarrass Hipparchia in front of an audience. "Is it not improper," he sneered, "for a woman to abandon her shuttles and looms and engage in philosophical argument?" Hipparchia, without missing a beat, replied, "Do you suppose that I have done wrong, Theodorus, in devoting that time to philosophy which I otherwise would have spent at the loom? It's a moment worthy of applause, even 2.5 millennia later, not because she bested a man, though she did, but because she exposed the absurdity of the standards being imposed upon her. Why should weaving be more virtuous than wisdom? Why should silence be more becoming than intellect?" In that one reply, she dismantled centuries of assumption. But perhaps the most outrageous, most talked about aspect of Hipparchia's life was not her words, but her presence. To walk the streets of Athens in the garb of a cynic was one thing for a man. It was odd, even laughable, but ultimately tolerable. For a woman, it was downright blasphemous. She was accused of shamelessness, of indecency, of behaving more like a dog than a lady. To which the cynics, of course, would say, exactly. For the cynic ideal was autarkia, self-sufficiency, and anaideia, or shamelessness. Not shamelessness in the tabloid sense of moral depravity, but a proud, pointed refusal to be governed by the false shame imposed by others. To live in accordance with nature meant discarding the masks, the pretensions, the scripts society foists upon us. Hipparchia and Crates, legend tells us, made love in public. Now before we clutch our pearls, and I do hope you've brought pearls expressly for clutching, let us consider what that act symbolized. For them, the private act made public was a declaration of honesty, of stripping away the hypocrisy of polite society. If animals do it, if humans do it, why wrap it in layers of taboo and concealment? Better to offend the senses than to offend reason. Of course, to Athens, it was scandalous, utterly indecent, and that in some strange way was the point. Hipparchia and Crates lived as provocations, not to titillate, but to awaken. And in this, she was not simply echoing the philosophy of men. She was embodying it in a way no man ever could. For her very existence, educated, articulate, and defiantly public, was a philosophical statement. She had become the Logos made flesh, a walking contradiction of everything respectable society claimed to believe. Yet she was no cold ideologue. Accounts describe her not as angry or bitter, but joyful, even playful. The cynics were often comedians as much as critics, and Hipparchia shared in that spirit. She and Crates were said to have lived not in ascetic gloom, but in cheerful poverty, finding delight in their freedom and in each other. One mustn't overlook how radical this model of partnership was. Crates did not lecture her, did not overshadow her, did not play the wise mentor to the junior student. They were equals, intellectual and emotional peers. That alone is extraordinary in any age, but staggeringly so in the 4th century BCE. And yet for all this, she was still dismissed by many. The male historians and scholars who wrote about her often treated her as a footnote, a curiosity. Diogenes Laertius, who preserved some of her story, includes her not with the greats, but in an appendix on women philosophers, a category as oxymoronic to him as honest politician might seem to some today. Still, we are left with the traces, the anecdotes, the defiant replies, and the unmistakable sense that here, was someone who lived her philosophy with more courage and consequence than many who filled whole scrolls with theirs. Hipparchia didn't just think differently, she was different, and she made that difference the source of her power. It is one of life's more enduringly absurd arrangements that some of the cleverest people to ever walk the earth have insisted with tireless conviction that walking the earth is precisely the problem. Humanity, they tell us, is forever distracted by its shiny toys, its grand ambitions, its architectural ego trips, its endless quest to build, to hoard, to impress. What fools we are, say the philosophers, collecting palaces when a warm patch of sun would do. Among this chorus of ancient curmudgeons, the Cynics sang the loudest, and Hipparchia of Maroneia sang in harmony. It is tempting, of course, to view Hipparchia as an accessory to Crates, his dutiful partner, an amusing anomaly in his story. That's certainly how many of the ancient sources treated her. But to do so is rather like calling Ada Lovelace a hobbyist or Mary Shelley a scribbler. Hipparchia was not a +1 in someone else's intellectual banquet. She was setting the table. What made her distinct, what made her astonishing, was not simply that she adopted the Cynic way of life, but that she interpreted it. She wasn't just parroting her husband's aphorisms. She was actively sculpting an answer to the oldest question in philosophy: how ought one to live? The Cynic's answer, boiled down and served lukewarm in a broken bowl, preferably outdoors, was this: one ought to live in accordance with nature. But what does that mean exactly? Well, to the Cynics, nature is simple. Nature does not care for wealth or status, or whether your sandals match your tunic. Nature does not blush. It does not judge. It simply is. And therefore, to be virtuous is to live as honestly, as minimally, and as shamelessly as the squirrels. Now, this is easy enough to romanticize. How delightful, we might say, to live freely and simply, untouched by the need for possessions or approval. But let us not be too quick to idealize the flea-bitten reality. This was not glamping with a philosophical twist. This was sleeping rough. This was enduring ridicule, hunger, weather, and indignity. This was refusing to trade your freedom for comfort, a trade the rest of us are all too willing to make. Hipparchia, more than almost any other figure, tested this ideal. She wasn't born to hardship. She hadn't been driven into poverty by misfortune. She chose it, deliberately, rationally, and irrevocably. She wasn't running from the world. She was running straight at it, cloak flapping in the wind, armed with reason and a scandalous refusal to be embarrassed. You see, for the Cynics, philosophy was not a subject one studied. It was a life one lived. They sneered at books and scrolls and fancy lecture halls. What use is wisdom, they asked, if it doesn't change how you rise, how you walk, how you speak to the man selling figs in the marketplace? Philosophy, in the Cynic sense, was meant to be embodied, which is to say, lived out in every sweaty, ridiculous, glorious moment of being human. And Hipparchia, by that measure, was a virtuoso. There's something profoundly disarming about her sincerity. She did not, like the Stoics, attempt to conquer emotion with the mind. Nor did she, like the Platonists, gaze upward to celestial ideals. She kept her eyes level with the dust and the donkeys. For her, virtue was not lofty. It was practical. It meant owning your choices, rejecting hypocrisy, and refusing to be manipulated by what others think you ought to be. And here is the rub. Hipparchia was not merely rejecting societal norms. She was showing that happiness lay beyond them. That true contentment wasn't about gaining more, but about needing less. A radical, almost heretical idea in a world, and indeed a species, that so often defines itself by acquisition. Even today, amid our clutter of smart devices, subscriptions, and self-improvement mantras, her life rings out with a provocative clarity. You don't need all this. She and Crates were, by all accounts, remarkably happy. Their partnership, stripped of artifice, was a kind of philosophical romance, a shared devotion, not just to each other, but to a way of life. They loved as cynics, argued as philosophers, and lived as human beings unshackled from convention. And what of her influence? Well, she had no formal school, no disciples in the traditional sense. No writings survive to be annotated, footnoted, and debated by ivory tower intellectuals. But perhaps her very absence from the scrolls is a kind of legacy. She is proof that philosophy need not reside in libraries. It can, and perhaps should, live in the body, in the streets, in the daily, daring act of being yourself. To walk the earth unashamed, to speak one's mind with clarity, to laugh at the pompous, and to love without apology. That, to Hipparchia, was philosophy. Not an abstract pursuit for bearded men in sunlit courtyards, but a daily rebellion against falseness. A way of walking through the world, feet calloused, eyes bright, and mind free. There is something delightfully subversive about a woman refusing to be quiet. Not simply in voice, mind you, but in presence, in posture, in her very way of taking up space in a world built to edge her out. Hipparchia of Maroneia didn't just raise her hand in a room full of men. She raised the bar, the tone, and the whole damned conversation. In the theatre of ancient Athens, where women were, quite literally, barred from performing on stage, Hipparchia did something truly outrageous. She stepped into the role of philosopher. Not the lady-in-waiting to male genius, not the muse, not the cautionary tale or mythic seductress, but an actual, bona fide, walking, talking, arguing, debating philosopher. The kind who asked awkward questions and refused to fetch the wine. And it wasn't just her presence that unsettled the Athenian order. It was what she represented. Because Hipparchia wasn't trying to sneak into male spaces and mimic them. She was dismantling the foundations they were built on. She didn't want a seat at the banquet. She questioned the need for the banquet at all. Let us remember that in the ancient Greek imagination, femininity was bound to a strange cocktail of silence, softness, and servitude. A woman who spoke too much was considered hysterical. One who thought too deeply was troubling, unnatural. The best woman was a shadow, still, supportive, silent, seen only in glimpses and rarely, if ever, heard. Hipparchia shattered that silhouette. She refused the loom, refused the veil, refused the role of good Athenian wife. Instead, she walked the city as an equal to any man, challenging ideas not from the margins, but from the center of the philosophical arena. She didn't plead to be accepted. She behaved as though she already belonged, which, of course, was her greatest transgression. It is worth pausing here to savor the exquisite scandal she must have been. Imagine the bearded scholars blinking in disbelief as she stood in the agora, refuting arguments with the same cool wit they prized in themselves, only more incisively. Imagine the startled students whispering as she engaged publicly in debates on logic, ethics, and human nature, not as a novelty, but as an intellectual force. She was not pretending to be a philosopher. She was one. There's a marvelous story, almost certainly apocryphal, though no less delicious for it, in which a man tries to humiliate her by asking why she has left her feminine duties to argue in public. Hipparchia, in true Cynic fashion, replies with a question of her own. Do you think I have done wrong in devoting that time to philosophy which I otherwise would have spent at the loom? There it is, again. the refusal to let someone else set the terms of the conversation. She upends not only the insult, but the world view it springs from. This is what makes her so fascinating. Not merely her courage, but her rhetorical clarity. She understood that shame is not a moral compass, but a social invention, often wielded to keep women in their place. So she walked through Athens, shorn of shame, bare of pretense, and scandalously proud. Even the physicality of her life was a statement. No makeup, no jewelry, no fine fabrics or demure modesty. Her cloak was threadbare, her body unadorned. She embraced her humanity not as a flaw to be tamed, but as a fact to be celebrated. The Cynics believed that nothing natural should be hidden, and Hipparchia took this maxim and made it a mirror, turning society's unease back upon itself. Of course, her critics clung to what little they had left, the argument that her very femininity was degraded by her freedom. But here too, Hipparchia flipped the script. In shedding societal expectations, she didn't lose her identity. She claimed it. She wasn't less of a woman for rejecting those roles. She was proof that womanhood itself need not be a cage. It's striking that centuries later, even feminist thinkers hesitate over her legacy. Was she truly emancipated, or simply trading one form of extremity for another? It's a fair question. After all, living in poverty, embracing public shamelessness, and abandoning nearly all comforts is not exactly what most would consider liberation. But Hipparchia's genius lies in her insistence that freedom means choosing your constraints. She did not flee from the expectations of womanhood into another prison. She walked away entirely. And not in isolation, but in full view of the world. She was not a philosopher who happened to be a woman. She was a philosopher who showed what philosophy could be when a woman lived it, fully and without apology. And in doing so, she became something even rarer than a female philosopher in the ancient world. She became unforgettable. In the great creaking library of history, dusty with the fingerprints of kings and conquerors, popes and professors, it is easy to lose sight of those who made their mark, not in ink, but in action. Those whose names weren't chiseled into marble or scrawled across empires, but who nonetheless shaped the world with the way they lived. Hipparchia of Maroneia is just such a figure. She wrote no books, she led no armies, she issued no laws, and yet she did something far rarer. She lived her philosophy with such relentless honesty that her very life became a kind of text. A woman with no estate, no title, no entourage, no scrolls, only her words, her mind, and a tattered cloak, walked into the heart of one of the most patriarchal societies in human history and declared, quite without ceremony, "I will not be small." She never asked to be let in. She simply behaved as though she belonged, and in doing so, she became something of a paradox. A philosopher who left no written work, yet who continues to inspire debates, essays, podcasts, and yes, YouTube series more than 2,000 years later. How does one measure a life like that? Not in property or children or lineages. That's the old rubric, the comfortable metrics of patriarchs and bureaucrats. No, Hipparchia invites us to weigh a life by a different scale. Did she live honestly? Did she resist hypocrisy? Did she live as though truth mattered more than approval? And by that reckoning, she towers. What's even more delicious than figs in springtime, is that the very system that tried to erase her, misogyny, academic snobbery, the sheer inertia of historical forgetfulness, has only made her more compelling. Because Hipparchia doesn't come to us in footnotes and fanfare. She comes as rumor, resistance, myth, and memory. She is philosophy's whisper, its raised eyebrow, its grin of defiance. And yes, of course, her life prompts endless questions. Was it practical? Was it sustainable? Was it necessary to be so extreme? But then again, if she had moderated herself, if she had lived in more palatable defiance, dined politely on virtue without ever staining her fingers, would we remember her? Would we care? The answer, I think, is no. What gives Hipparchia her remarkable power is not just that she thought outside the box, but that she refused to live inside it. She wasn't content to question society from a safe remove. She left it, in body and in spirit, to show us what an alternative might look like. And in doing so, she gave us more than a glimpse of the Cynic ideal. She gave us a version of freedom not built on dominion, or wealth, or recognition, but on radical self-sufficiency. A freedom where virtue was not a virtue unless it was lived. Where wisdom did not sit on a shelf, it walked beside you, barefoot, through the streets. Of course, she has her critics, then and now. Some say she merely echoed crates. Others dismiss her as performative, eccentric, or naively idealistic. But I suspect these criticisms say more about us than they do about her. Because Hipparchia didn't live to be admired. She lived to be free. And isn't that the thing we struggle with most? The sheer audacity of someone, especially a woman, choosing freedom over safety, truth over respectability, life over legacy. It reminds us that we too could live differently, that we too might shed our masks, our habits, our obedient little lives. But most of us won't. We'll compromise and justify and settle, because that's what civilization demands, isn't it? But somewhere, deep in the marrow of our modernity, Hipparchia still lingers, not as a saint, not as a slogan, but as a sort of inner provocation, a challenge in human form. She reminds us that philosophy is not a game of definitions, not a quiet contemplative art. It's an act, a life, a dare. And if we're very lucky, if we listen closely, perhaps in the unlikeliest moments, we may hear her still. A woman in a cloak, smiling faintly, asking, "And what exactly are you afraid of?"